In 1994, Amazon didn't begin in a boardroom, a Silicon Valley campus, or a pitch meeting filled with investors. It began inside a moving car, crossing the American landscape from east to west, with a man typing a business plan while asphalt rolled endlessly beneath the wheels. There was no certainty, no applause, no validation. There was only a quiet calculation that something massive was about to change, and that waiting on the sidelines would be the most dangerous choice of all. Most people imagine empires starting with vision, charisma, or bold storytelling. Jeff Bezos started with probability. He wasn't chasing a dream or a passion project. He was chasing a curve, a growth rate so steep it felt less like business and more like gravity, slowly taking control. To Bezos, this wasn't about imagination. It was about inevitability. Jeff Bezos' childhood offered little glamour or mythology. He was born to a teenage mother, his biological father disappearing early, leaving behind no legacy to inherit. When his mother later married a Cuban immigrant engineer who adopted him, Bezos grew up in a household shaped by discipline, practicality, and problem solving. This wasn't privilege in the traditional sense. It was structure, routine, and expectations built around effort rather than entitlement. From an early age, Bezos wasn't driven by approval or popularity. He didn't seek admiration. He sought understanding. He was drawn to systems, patterns, and mechanisms that explained how things worked beneath the surface. If something worked once, it could work again. If it could work again, it could be repeated. And if it could be repeated reliably, it could scale. To Bezos, scale wasn't just growth. Scale was power. That mindset hardened at Princeton. Engineering and computer science didn't just teach him technical skills, they shaped how he viewed the world itself. Complexity wasn't mysterious. It was something to be broken down, mapped, optimized, and controlled. Emotion didn't solve problems. Inspiration didn't solve problems. Systems did. After graduation, Bezos didn't chase startups or idealistic ventures. He chased proximity to capital, data, and leverage. Wall Street offered all three. In the financial world, information moved fast, decisions were quantified, and scale determined survival. Bezos learned how markets behaved under pressure, how risk was priced, and how small advantages compounded over time. He was preparing, even if he didn't fully know it yet. Then he encountered a single number that reframed everything. Internet usage was growing at a rate that defied historical comparison. To most people in the early 1990s, the internet felt experimental, niche, even temporary. To Bezos, it looked unavoidable. This wasn't a trend. It was an infrastructure being born. Bezos approached the opportunity the way an engineer would. He didn't fall in love with the idea. He stress-tested it. He listed dozens of possible online businesses: music, clothing, electronics, pet supplies. Most failed under scrutiny. One didn't. Books weren't exciting or glamorous, but they were perfect. Millions of titles, standardized formats, existing demand, and no dominant online distributor. Books weren't the destination. They were the entry point. Walking away from a senior role on Wall Street to sell books online sounded irresponsible, even irrational. His peers saw it as self-sabotage. Bezos saw it differently. He believed the greatest risk wasn't failure. It was regret that compounded silently over decades. Failure could be recovered from, regret could not. Amazon's early days were raw, messy, and inefficient by design. Frugality wasn't a branding choice or a cultural quirk. It was strategy. Cheap desks, cramped spaces, long hours, and constant improvisation weren't signs of weakness. They were proof that every available resource was being redirected toward growth and survival. Orders arrived slowly at first, then faster, then in waves that overwhelmed the system. The bell that once rang for every sale eventually fell silent, not because demand disappeared, but because it became constant. What started as novelty quickly became momentum. Bezos wasn't selling books anymore. He was selling time, convenience, certainty. Customers didn't just buy from Amazon. They adjusted their expectations around it. Shopping elsewhere began to feel inefficient, even frustrating. Amazon went public without profits, and critics openly mocked the model. Analysts dismissed it as unsustainable, irrational, even reckless. Bezos ignored them. Growth came first. profit could wait. In a world being reshaped by scale, patience became a competitive weapon. Customer reviews transformed the platform in a subtle but profound way. Transparency felt dangerous. Allowing criticism on your own website went against retail instinct. But trust scaled faster than advertising ever could. Customers stayed longer, returned more often, and relied on Amazon not just to buy, but to decide. Marketplace marked the real turning point. Amazon stopped owning everything and started controlling everything. It positioned itself as the infrastructure where commerce happened, extracting value not from inventory, but from access. Then the bubble burst. Capital vanished. Confidence collapsed. The optimism of the late 1990s evaporated almost overnight. Amazon stood on the edge of extinction as competitors disappeared entirely. Survival was no longer theoretical. Bezos didn't panic. He cut deeply and without sentiment. Projects were canceled. Teams were dismantled. Experimentation gave way to discipline. The company emerged colder, leaner, and far more resilient than before. Logistics became the obsession. Warehouses evolved into machines. Efficiency replaced improvisation. Human effort became a variable to be measured, optimized, and minimized. This wasn't retail anymore. It was industrialized distribution. Prime wasn't free shipping. It was behavioral engineering. Speed rewired expectations. Convenience reshaped habits. Once customers adapted to that new baseline, leaving Amazon felt irrational. AWS quietly changed the balance of power. Amazon wasn't competing anymore. It was hosting the competition itself, collecting rent from the digital economy while remaining invisible to most users. As dominance grew, so did controversy. Sellers accused Amazon of exploitation. Workers described relentless pressure. Regulators began to circle. The system held because it had been designed to. When Bezos stepped aside, nothing broke. Operations continued. Growth persisted. That was the final confirmation. The machine no longer required its creator. Amazon was never the destination. It was infrastructure, a launchpad, a system designed to outlast individuals. For the boy who once dreamed of orbital cities and space habitats, Earth was only phase 1. The system is built. The next frontier is already in motion. Phase 1 was about proving that scale could exist without collapsing, about showing that an abstract idea convenience delivered through systems could be engineered, repeated, and defended against chaos. Once that proof existed, the question was no longer whether the model worked. The question became how far it could extend before it began reshaping the environment around it. At a certain point, growth stops being ambition and becomes obligation. Systems that reach massive scale are no longer free to pause, reflect, or reverse. Momentum hardens into necessity. Standing still feels indistinguishable from failure, even when everything appears to be functioning perfectly. What began as expansion slowly transforms into maintenance of dominance. From the outside, this looks like intention. From the inside, it feels automatic. Decisions aren't made to conquer new territory, but to avoid losing ground that already exists. The system doesn't ask what it should become next. It only asks what it cannot afford to stop doing. This is where companies stop behaving like organizations and begin behaving like environments. You don't interact with them in isolated moments. You exist within their gravity. Choices narrow not because alternatives vanish, but because friction makes them feel irrational. Convenience doesn't remove options. It makes deviation exhausting. For customers, this transition is nearly invisible. Efficiency masks influence. Speed disguises dependency. What works exceptionally well rarely feels threatening. The smoother the experience, the less it invites scrutiny. Over time, expectations recalibrate, and what once felt extraordinary becomes the baseline for normal. Internally, the transformation is more explicit. Judgment gives way to metrics. Intuition is replaced by dashboards. Decisions are validated not by wisdom, but by alignment with optimization frameworks. Human discretion becomes noise tolerated only when it doesn't interfere with throughput, predictability, or scale. At this stage, power no longer resides in individuals. It lives in process. No single person understands the entire machine because no single person needs to. The system fragments responsibility while centralizing outcome. Influence becomes diffuse, making accountability increasingly abstract. This is why founders eventually become symbolic. Their presence matters less than the architecture they leave behind. When they step aside and nothing breaks, it isn't a sign of decline. It's proof that the system has reached autonomy. The creator becomes optional. The structure does not. Once that threshold is crossed, origin stories lose their relevance. Garages, risks, early sacrifices, they harden into mythology. What remains is infrastructure, quietly shaping behavior at a scale too large to feel personal, yet too pervasive to escape. Amazon didn't dominate because it inspired loyalty. It dominated because it engineered inevitability. It positioned itself not as a destination, but as the default. And when something becomes default, replacing it feels less like choice and more like disruption. The most powerful systems don't demand allegiance. They simply make alternatives feel inefficient. Over time, resistance reframes itself as inconvenience. Opting out feels less like principle and more like self-sabotage. This was never a story about retail, or books, or even technology. It was a story about what happens when optimization is allowed to run uninterrupted, when scale compounds without moral friction, when success stops being a phase and becomes a permanent condition. At that point, the question is no longer who controls the system. The question is whether anyone truly can. And once that question emerges, the system has already moved beyond its creators, its critics, and even its original purpose. It no longer asks where it is going. It only continues forward, because stopping was never designed into it. Earth was only phase one.